She called it an exaggeration. Daniel Marsh stood at the front of the Chandler Development boardroom on the 14th floor, his inspection report open on the table, 12 board members watching him with the particular patience of people who had already made up their minds. Elizabeth Chandler sat at the head of the table, and when he finished speaking, she looked at him the way executives look at contractors who have just tried to sell them something they didn't ask for. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "we appreciate the report, but this reads like a firm inflating risk to justify a longer engagement." Daniel closed the folder. Across the table, Richard Voss smiled just barely, just once. The drive back to Millvale took 22 minutes. Daniel knew because he watched the clock the whole way, the kind of mindless tracking a person does when their thoughts are somewhere they can't look at directly. He lived in a narrow house at the end of Chestnut Street, the kind of house that cost more to maintain than it was worth and held more than it looked like it could. He had bought it 4 years ago with money left from Claire's life insurance, and in the time since, it had become the kind of place where the living room was full of Emma's drawings, and the kitchen table was never completely clear, and the backyard smelled like cut grass in summer because Emma liked to watch him mow. Emma was 9. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and a habit of asking questions that landed harder than she knew. She was at school when Daniel got home, so the house was quiet. He set his bag on the kitchen chair, put on coffee he didn't drink, and stood at the window over the sink, looking at the garage. The work was what it was. Independent structural inspector, license renewed every 2 years, clientele built mostly through referrals from smaller contractors who needed someone thorough and affordable. He made enough, not comfortably, but enough school supplies, groceries, the occasional field trip fee paid on time if not early. He had structured the work around Emma's schedule by design. That part had never felt like a sacrifice. He did not think of himself as someone who had walked away from anything. He thought of himself as someone who had made a choice, and who was still living with it, and who was mostly at peace with the arithmetic of that. He had made other choices before the one about walking away, and some of them had cost more than this one, and he had survived all of them. That was the operating principle. The Chandler job had come through a referral from a subcontractor named Pete Gallagher, who had done concrete work on the Mill Point Tower project before Chandler Development took over the general contract. Pete had mentioned something wasn't sitting right with him, the rebar spacing on the lower floors, the way the pouring schedule had been compressed. He couldn't say more than that. He just wanted someone to look. Daniel had looked. He had spent 3 weeks looking, and what he found had taken him another 2 weeks to document properly, because he wanted to be certain before he said anything. The report was 112 pages. He had not padded it. Every figure in it was sourced. Every recommendation was benchmarked against federal code. Every risk assessment was grounded in observed data rather than projection. It was the most thorough document he had produced in 4 years of independent work, and it had been dismissed in 11 minutes. In the garage, behind 2 folding chairs and a box of Emma's outgrown winter coats, there was a plastic storage bin with a gray lid. He had not opened it in 14 months. Inside were the files from the work he had done before project binders, technical correspondence, a printed copy of his federal engineering credentials, 2 patent certificates in a manila envelope. He thought about the bin now, standing at the kitchen window, and then he heard the school bus at the corner and let the thought go. The discomfort didn't leave. It just moved somewhere quieter, the way it always did. The call came on a Tuesday evening, while Daniel was helping Emma with a long division worksheet she deeply resented. "Take your time," he told her. "Don't skip the step." His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, a number with a Washington, D.C. area code he hadn't seen in 3 years. He silenced the screen, finished the problem with Emma, made sure she understood the method, and then stepped into the hallway. "Marcus," he said when he called back. "Daniel." Marcus Webb's voice was the same, careful, unhurried, the product of 22 years in federal infrastructure oversight. "I heard you took on the Chandler job." "I did, and they turned it down." Daniel didn't ask how he knew. The structural engineering world in western Pennsylvania was smaller than it looked. "They did." "I want to send you something," Marcus said. "Some background on Chandler Development's procurement history. There's a pattern in the capital expenditure filings over the last 3 years that I think you'll find relevant." "Marcus." Daniel leaned against the hallway wall. I'm not going back. I'm not asking you to go back. I'm asking you to look at a document. There was a silence. Outside, a car moved slowly past the house, its headlights tracking across the hallway wall and then gone. You could still be doing what you were built to do, Marcus said. Not as pressure as fact. He said it the way you'd tell someone their coat was on inside out. I'm doing something else now, Daniel said. And it's fine. After he hung up, he stood in the hallway for a moment. Through the kitchen doorway he could hear Emma erasing something aggressively, the sound of the rubber working back and forth across the paper. He went back and sat down across from her. You looked weird just now, she said without looking up. I'm fine. You looked like you did when you found out the dishwasher was broken. Finish your homework. She did. He watched her work, and when she got the next problem right without help, he didn't say anything, just moved the scratch paper aside so she had more room. The window over the sink was dark by then, and the garage was just a shape in the backyard, and the plastic bin with the gray lid was something he was not thinking about, but he kept the data from the Chandler inspection. All of it, the raw measurements, the load calculations, the photographs of the lower column connections, the rebar spacing documentation that nobody had wanted. He backed it up to a drive and kept the drive in his desk drawer, not because he had a plan, but because throwing it away had never felt like an option. He was not angry at Elizabeth Chandler. He told himself this carefully, the way you check a structure for load methodically, without assumption. He went through it. She had made a decision based on the information she chose to trust. She had looked at his report, and looked at the man who had written it, and decided Voss was more credible. That was her call to make. Executives made those calls every day, and most of the time they were fine, and this time she had been wrong, and she did not yet know it. What kept him awake was simpler than anger. It was the fact that the building was still standing, and that people were still walking into it every morning, and that what he knew and what they didn't know was a gap, that the building itself would eventually close. Physics did not negotiate. It did not accept revised audit summaries or defer to board decisions. It simply kept applying force until something gave. He knew what happened when something gave. He had written 200 pages about it for the Army Corps of Engineers after a flood control failure in Kentucky in 2015. He did not want to write those pages again. The first sign appeared on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the board meeting. A maintenance worker at Mill Point Tower reported a hairline fracture along the east wall of the basement parking level. The report went to the facilities manager, who forwarded it to Chandler Development's project management team, where it landed on the desk of Grace Whitfield. Grace was 55, with short gray hair and the particular efficiency of someone who had managed construction projects for 3 decades and had learned to notice things that other people filed away. She looked at the photograph attached to the report. The fracture ran diagonally from a seam in the concrete block down toward the floor drain, and did not immediately forward it. She printed it instead, wrote the date in the corner, and put it in the second drawer of her desk. 2 floors up, Elizabeth Chandler received a 1-paragraph summary from the facilities team, which described the fracture as cosmetic and attributed it to standard settlement in the building's 2nd year of occupancy. The summary had been drafted by Richard Voss's office. Liz read it at 7:45 in the morning, before her first call of the day, while standing at her desk with a coffee she hadn't had time to sit down with. She read it once, flagged it for follow-up, and moved on. The day had 10 more items behind it. Voss appeared in her doorway at 8:15, as if he had known when she'd be free. The Mill Point item, he said. Completely routine. I've seen it a dozen times on buildings this age. I didn't ask, Liz said. I know. I just wanted you to have the context before you heard anything else. He smiled, the practiced, even smile of a man who had spent decades being the most settled person in the room. Buildings breathe. It's nothing. She nodded. She didn't tell him she'd flagged it for follow-up, because she was already wondering if she'd been too cautious. And in Liz's experience, wondering whether you were too cautious was the beginning of being not cautious enough. That same morning, Daniel Marsh drove past Mill Point Tower on his way to a site inspection in the Strip District. He wasn't looking for anything. He just knew the building's face by now, the way you recognize a route you've driven too many times. 32 floors of curtain glass and exposed concrete. A corner site at Penn and 11th, the kind of design that photographed well and required regular attention to stay sound. He stopped at the light on Penn Avenue and looked up at the east facade. From this angle, in the low morning light, He could see the water staining on the foundation line a faint discoloration, darker at the base than it should be for a building barely 2 years old. He watched it for the duration of the red light. The light changed. He drove. The observation sat in the back of his mind all day, behind the inspection in the Strip District and Emma's after-school pickup and the invoice he needed to send before the end of the week. It was not dramatic. It was just a piece of data that didn't quite match what it should have been, filed somewhere below conscious thought, the way the body files the sound of a step that doesn't land right. He told himself it was nothing. He had told himself this before. The shareholders' meeting was on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room on the 13th floor of Chandler Development's corporate headquarters, and it went exactly as well as Liz had expected, which was to say it did not go well. 3 of the 7 major investors asked about Millpoint Tower, not because they had heard anything specific, only because they tracked sentiment, and sentiment around the project had shifted in the past 2 weeks in ways that were difficult to name but easy to feel. One of them mentioned, almost in passing, that a competing firm's structural inspection had flagged concerns with similar tower-style construction in Cleveland. He said it the way people say things they want on the record without wanting to own them. Liz answered each question steadily. She did not say anything she didn't believe. She also did not say that she had thought about the inspection report she'd dismissed 3 weeks ago, not constantly, but with the specific frequency of something that won't quite settle. The report lived at the edge of her attention the way a sound does when you're not sure you heard it correctly. She did not call Daniel Marsh. She was not sure what she would say. On Friday evening, she went to a neighborhood fundraiser for the Lawrenceville Community Garden, a quiet obligation, a small check, an hour of standing near a folding table of food she didn't eat. She was speaking with a city council member when she saw him. Daniel Marsh was across the room, holding a paper cup and listening to someone she didn't recognize. He wore a gray jacket that had been washed too many times, and he was not looking at her. She excused herself and crossed the room without deciding to. "Mr. Marsh," he turned. There was a brief adjustment in his expression, not surprise, exactly more like the moment before you respond to something you weren't expecting to have to respond to. "Miss Chandler, I didn't know you were involved with the garden project. My daughter's class did a planting day here in the fall," he said. "They invited the parents back." A pause. The noise of the room moved around them, voices, the scrape of folding chairs, someone at the door letting in a gust of October air. "How is your work going?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Steady." He looked at her with the kind of directness that wasn't aggressive, just undecorated. "How's Millpoint?" "Everything is on schedule," she said. He nodded once, as if that were a complete answer to a different question. The gap between what was said and what was understood was brief and exact, and they both felt it, and neither of them named it. She stayed another 4 minutes. When she left, she did not look back, but she was aware, with a precision that had nothing to do with architecture, of where he was standing. The following Monday, Voss submitted a revised internal audit summary to the board. He had spent the weekend on it. 3 columns of figures had been shifted, not dramatically, just enough to move certain expenditure categories out of the range that would trigger a third-party review. It was the kind of adjustment that required knowing exactly which numbers mattered, and exactly how far they could move before they became conspicuous. Grace Whitfield was the only person at Chandler Development who both knew what to look for and was still looking. The evacuation happened on a Tuesday. A sensor on the 4th sublevel of Millpoint Tower's parking structure registered a load shift at 11:40 in the morning. The building's automated system, calibrated during the original commissioning phase, flagged the anomaly but did not trigger an alarm. The shift fell below the threshold that had been set at construction completion, a threshold that Daniel's report had specifically argued was set too low. A maintenance supervisor named Howard noticed a sound he later described as like the building clearing its throat. He made a judgment call and called the facilities manager, who called Chandler Development's emergency line, who called Voss, who was on a call with a lender and did not immediately pick up. 62 people were in the building. The evacuation took 11 minutes. No one was injured. By 2 in the afternoon, it was on the local news. By 4, it was on the wire. By 6, Chandler Development stock had dropped 9%. Liz was in the building when the alarm went out. She stood on Penn Avenue in the cold November air with 61 other people and watched the facade of Millpoint Tower, and felt something that she would not have known how to describe out loud. Not panic, but a kind of interior stillness that comes when a thing you have been not quite thinking about arrives in physical form. The report. The fracture photograph in the facilities summary, the way Marsh had said, "How's Mill Point?" and waited. Voss reached her by phone at 3. "This is manageable," he said immediately. 11 minutes to evacuate 32 floors, she said. "The system performed exactly as designed, Richard." Her voice was flat. "Get me the original load threshold documentation, the commissioning records, everything. A beat. I'll have it to you by morning." "Tonight," she said. By 7, she ended the call. Across the street, a news van was setting up. A reporter she recognized from the business segment was speaking into a phone, one hand raised against the wind. Inside the Chandler development offices, Grace Whitfield opened her second desk drawer and looked at the photograph she had printed 3 weeks ago, with the date written in the corner. Then she opened her laptop and began to type. The next morning, Liz confronted Voss in his office. She had the commissioning records, which he had provided with notable promptness. She also had 3 questions she had written down on a notepad the night before, because she had learned a long time ago that the questions you prepare at midnight are the ones that matter. He answered all 3. His answers were smooth, internally consistent, and told her almost nothing. When she left his office, she had the distinct sensation of having walked through a carefully decorated room and discovered, too late, that none of the walls were load-bearing. That evening, Daniel Marsh addressed an envelope. Inside was a 12-page technical summary, no letterhead, no signature documenting the load threshold discrepancy, cross-referenced against the original inspection data and the evacuation anomaly. He drove to the Chandler development offices at 9:30 in the evening and placed it in the internal mail slot marked Grace Whitfield, Project Management. He drove home. Emma was asleep. He checked on her, stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her breathing in the dark, and then went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table without turning on a light. He had mentioned the Chandler situation to no one. At school pickup that Friday, Emma had said, unprompted, "Dad, do you know a man named Mr. Voss?" "Kayla's dad knows him. He comes to their house sometimes," Daniel had said. "Why?" Kayla said her dad does work for his company, and he always brings stuff over. Emma had shrugged with the thoroughness of a 9-year-old who had reported the information and now considered it handled. "Is he nice?" Daniel had said he didn't know him well. He had thought about it for the rest of the drive home, and he was still thinking about it now, at the kitchen table in the dark, because the thing about small pieces of information is that they are only small until they aren't. Grace Whitfield arrived at Elizabeth Chandler's office at 7:45 on a Thursday morning, before anyone else was in. She knocked twice. "I need to show you something," Grace said, "and I need you to understand that I'm not doing this to hurt the company." She set a folder on Liz's desk. Inside were 3 years of internal capital expenditure reports, annotated in Grace's precise handwriting. Alongside them was a set of original procurement invoices, the actual invoices, not the summaries that had gone to the board, and a spreadsheet Grace had built over 4 weeks, reconciling the 2 sets of numbers. The discrepancy was not large in any single line. Across 3 years, it came to $1,400,000, redirected through a vendor entity that, when Grace had traced the registration, turned out to share an address with a holding company connected to Richard Voss. The structural material substitutions, the compressed rebar spacing, the reduced-grade concrete pours, the load-bearing compromises Daniel's report had documented were where the money had come from. Liz did not speak for a long time after she finished reading. "Why now?" she finally asked. Grace looked at her hands. "Because of the evacuation. Because I watched 62 people walk out of that building and thought about what it would have meant if Howard hadn't been paying attention." She paused. "And because someone sent me a technical summary last week that I think you should also read." She placed Daniel's envelope on the desk. Liz opened it. She read the 12 pages in 11 minutes. Not because she was rushing, but because the document was written with the kind of compression that comes from someone who has done this for a very long time and knows exactly which words carry weight. The load calculations were airtight. The cross-references were precise. The conclusions were measured and devastating and identical to what had been in the report she'd dismissed 11 weeks earlier. She thought about the board meeting, The folder he'd closed without argument, the way he hadn't looked at Voss when he left the room, and the way Voss had smiled, and how she had read both of those things and chosen not to read them correctly. That evening, she drove to Millvale. The house on Chestnut Street had lights on in the kitchen and a bicycle on the front porch. She rang the bell. Daniel opened the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses he immediately removed. He looked at her the way she had looked at the evacuation report, with no expression available for the occasion. "Miss Chandler." "Liz," she said. "I came to apologize." He stepped back from the door. She came inside. The kitchen smelled like something with tomatoes. The table had homework on it, and a half-finished glass of milk, and a set of colored pencils arranged with the unconscious order of a child who had recently been here and recently left. "My daughter just went to bed," he said. "I have coffee." "That's fine." They sat at the kitchen table. She told him what Grace had found. He listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around his mug. His face, the face of someone receiving information they had partly expected and had not wanted to be right about. "I dismissed your report," she said. "Publicly. In front of 12 people. You were given bad information," he said. "I didn't push back on it." He didn't argue the point. From the hallway came the sound of small feet on hardwood. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway in pajamas, evaluating Liz with the frank assessment of a child who has decided to trust her instincts. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Liz said. "Are you my dad's friend?" Daniel said. "Emma." "She can answer," Emma said reasonably. "I think we're getting there," Liz said. Emma appeared satisfied with this. She asked if she could have water. Daniel got up and got it for her. He walked her back to her room, and Liz sat at the kitchen table and listened to the sounds of that, his voice low, Emma's brief protest at having to go back to bed, the door clicking shut. He came back and sat down. They didn't say anything for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the backyard was dark, and somewhere in the neighborhood a dog was barking twice, and then stopping. "I need your help," she said. "I know," he said. They worked at the kitchen table for 3 evenings in a row. Liz brought her laptop and Grace's files. Daniel pulled the original inspection data from his desk drawer, the drive he had kept because throwing it away had never felt like an option, and began building a timeline. He worked the way he always worked, methodically and without commentary, and Liz matched his pace rather than asking him to slow down. She had the instinct of someone accustomed to managing complex projects, and she applied it here without ceremony, sorting documents, flagging discrepancies, asking precise questions when she needed answers. On the second evening, she looked up from a procurement record and said, "How do you know load threshold documentation this precisely? You've been doing independent inspections for what, 4 years?" He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table was the only light on in the house. "Before that," he said carefully, "I did infrastructure work for the Army Corps of Engineers. Federal projects, critical infrastructure, bridges, flood control systems, levee assessments, things that fail in ways that make the national news." She looked at him steadily. "I left after my wife died," he said. "Emma was 5. I needed work I could schedule around a kindergartner, work where I could be at pickup and home by 6. Liz looked back at the document in front of her. She did not say anything for a moment, which was the right thing to do. "The patents on load distribution methodology co-inventor listed in the 2019 Federal Infrastructure Report," she said eventually. "That's you." He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. On the third evening, Daniel's phone rang. He looked at the screen and set it face down on the table. 5 minutes later, Liz's phone rang. "Voss," she said, looking at the screen. "He knows," Daniel said. Liz picked up the call. She kept her voice level through 4 minutes of Richard Voss explaining, with great precision and no apparent urgency, that the board had concerns about Grace Whitfield's documentation practices, that certain members of the investor group had expressed discomfort with recent informal communications, and that it might be appropriate for Liz to step back from direct management of the Mill Point situation, pending a formal internal review. She let him finish. "Good night, Richard," she said, and hung up. She set her phone on the table. Daniel was looking at her. "He's going to move tomorrow," she said. "Then we work tonight," he said. They did. By 2 in the morning the timeline was complete, 16 pages. Every material substitution matched to a procurement record. Every procurement record matched to a Voss-connected vendor invoice. The load threshold manipulation, documented alongside the original inspection findings. It was the kind of document that did not leave room for interpretation. The question was, what came next? And they both sat with it for a moment in the kitchen, while the dog down the street made up its mind about something in the dark. "I need to protect Grace," Liz said. "That means moving first," Daniel said. "Yes. Are you ready to do that?" She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, his hands flat on the file, his reading glasses on the stack of papers beside the drive. "I don't have a choice," she said. "And neither do you." He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded once, and they went back to work. The structural failure at Mill Point Tower happened at 8:51 on a Monday morning. The east wall of the fourth parking sublevel shifted by approximately 2.5 inches along a 40-foot span. It was not a collapse. It was the kind of failure that engineers call a precursor event, the building telling you, in the language of physics, that it had been asked to do something it was not designed to do, and had been doing it for long enough that it was finished pretending otherwise. No one was in the parking structure when it happened. That was not luck. 3 days earlier, Daniel had submitted a confidential technical brief to the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Permits, Licenses, and Inspections, detailing the load threshold documentation and requesting an emergency structural review of the lowest 2 sublevels. He had attached a copy of the full 16-page timeline. He had listed his credentials in full for the first time in 4 years: Army Corps of Engineers, 14 years. Critical Infrastructure Division, Federal Patents, the works. The city had responded by quietly posting inspectors to the building's lower levels during off hours, and by issuing an internal advisory to the facilities management team. Howard, the maintenance supervisor who had already decided to pay attention, had made sure the parking structure was cleared well before the Monday morning rush began. The police were outside within 7 minutes. The city engineers arrived within 20. By 9:30, Mill Point Tower's structural engineering file had been formally flagged for emergency review by the Bureau of Building Inspection, and 2 inspectors were already photographing the shifted wall section in the parking sublevel. The stock dropped 14% before 11 o'clock. Trading in Chandler Development shares was briefly halted at 10:45. As the news spread beyond Pittsburgh's local outlets to the national wire services, the board called an emergency meeting for 2 in the afternoon. 12 people in a room, the same number as the first meeting, though the air was entirely different now. Voss arrived early and took his seat at the side of the table and spent the opening minutes constructing his account: a facilities management failure, a calibration error in the automated systems, a breakdown in oversight protocols under Elizabeth Chandler's direction. He was building toward a third version of this when the door opened. Daniel Marsh walked in. He had his credentials folder in one hand and the 16-page timeline in the other, and he looked exactly like a man who had spent 20 years building things that had to stand up. He set the timeline on the table. "My name is Daniel Marsh," he said. "I hold a professional engineering license in structural engineering, 2 federal patents in load distribution methodology, and prior to my independent practice, I served as lead structural engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers Critical Infrastructure Division for 14 years. He looked at the board members, not at Voss. "I conducted the inspection of Mill Point Tower that this board declined to act on 11 weeks ago. I'd like to walk you through what I found and what has happened since." Voss said, "This is highly irregular." "Richard," said the board chair, a quiet man named Leonard Hatch, who had not spoken yet, "sit down." "Vossat." Daniel began to speak. He spoke for 31 minutes. He did not rush, and he did not editorialize, and the room was completely quiet. When he finished, Leonard Hatch asked 3 questions. The 2 board members with engineering backgrounds asked 4 more. Daniel answered each one with the specificity of someone who had not needed to review the material before walking into the room. Voss said nothing after the first 3 minutes. He had understood, somewhere around page 8 of the timeline, where things were going, and he had made the calculation that the most useful thing he could do was stop talking. At 4:15, the board voted to suspend Richard Voss from his duties pending a full internal review. By 5 o'clock, based on the evidence package that Daniel had already submitted to the city, the Pittsburgh District Attorney's Office had opened a preliminary investigation into construction fraud and falsification of safety records. The DA's office moved quickly because Daniel's documentation was organized the way a federal engineer organizes documentation, which is to say, as if it were going to be read by people who were looking for reasons to question it and finding none. Voss left the building through a side entrance with his jacket over one arm and his phone pressed to his ear. He did not look at Liz on the way out, and he did not look at Daniel. There was nothing left that would help, and he was smart enough to know it. Liz stood at the front of the hallway after the board had cleared and spoke to the staff and investors who had gathered there. She did not have notes. She said that the company had failed, and that the failure had started with a decision she had made 11 weeks ago in that same building, and that the most honest thing she could do now was name that clearly and then do the work of making it right. She acknowledged Daniel by name. She described what he had found and what he had tried to tell them, and what had happened to that information. She said it without softening, and the people listening were quiet in the particular way of people who are recalibrating. Daniel was near the back of the room. He watched her and felt something shift, not dramatically, just the way a room changes when a window is finally opened. After the hallway cleared, she crossed to where he stood. She looked like someone who had just set down something she'd been carrying a long distance. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. He didn't say "you're welcome," because that wasn't quite right, and she understood that from the way he didn't say it. "Emma said to tell you she hopes your day went okay," he said. Liz laughed, a real one, short and surprised. It changed her face entirely. He walked her to the elevator. They stood without speaking until it came, and when the doors closed he stood there a moment before turning for the stairs, and neither of them had said the things that were true but that didn't need saying yet. 5 weeks later, Chandler Development began its restructuring, under a new chief operating officer appointed by the board. The Mill Point Tower project was placed under independent structural monitoring, with quarterly city inspections mandated by formal agreement with the DA's office. Richard Voss had retained a criminal defense attorney and was not speaking publicly about anything. Daniel received a formal letter from Chandler Development's general counsel in the third week of December, offering him a contract as independent structural safety consultant for the company's active portfolio. The rate was generous. The terms were clearly defined. The engagement was limited to his specialty and respectful of his schedule. The letter was countersigned by Elizabeth Chandler. He read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, while Emma ate cereal, and explained to him, in considerable detail, the plot of a book she was reading about a girl who discovers her elderly neighbor is training carrier pigeons for long-distance racing. "Would you even want a carrier pigeon?" she said. "I'd want to know what it was carrying," he said. "Dad, that's not the point." He signed the letter. Emma knew about Liz the way children know things, through accumulation of small evidence rather than announcement. Liz had been to the house twice more in November, once to go through remaining documents, and once for nothing Daniel could precisely name, though they had ended up talking at the kitchen table for 2 hours after the documents were long since handled. Emma had been awake for the second visit. She had shown Liz her book collection, with the focused enthusiasm of someone presenting evidence in a case she had already decided to win. On a Saturday in mid-December, Liz came for dinner. It was not planned as an occasion. Daniel had made pasta with a sauce that used canned tomatoes and more garlic than was probably necessary, and Emma had decided, unilaterally and without consultation, that the table should have the candles from the cabinet above the refrigerator. He had not argued. There were battles worth having, and this was not one of them. Dinner was easy in the way of things that have been built slowly and without pressure. Emma asked Liz about her job with genuine curiosity, and Liz answered seriously. She described what a CEO actually does on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not what Emma had imagined, and Emma found the reality more interesting than the version she'd constructed. Daniel watched them talk. He got up to pour water, and when he sat back down, Liz caught his eye across the table for a moment, not saying anything, just looking, the candle light between them moving gently when someone reached across the table. After dinner, Emma fell asleep on the couch before her bedtime, which Daniel had begun to suspect was not entirely accidental. He carried her to her room and pulled the blanket up, and when he came back down the stairs, Liz was standing at the back door, looking out at the yard through the glass. He stood beside her. The yard was dark, the grass silver gray in the December cold, the garage a solid shape at the far end against the sky. The plastic bin with the gray lid was still in there, still behind the folding chairs. He'd opened it once since November, just to look. It had seemed, for the first time in 4 years, like something that belonged to a continuous life rather than a different one. "She's going to make a good case for the pigeon," Liz said. She's going to win, he said. A quiet settled between them. That was comfortable the way quiet gets when it has been earned. The back porch light threw a rectangle of yellow across the frost on the grass, and somewhere a few blocks over a car passed without hurrying, and the neighborhood was the particular kind of still it gets in December, when the year is almost over, and there is nothing left to decide tonight. He looked at her. She was already looking at him. Neither of them had been looking,